Here at the ISGAP luncheon, I have the great pleasure of standing with a friend and one of the real good guys on the American Jewish scene, Charles Small. First of all, Mazal Tov.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's wonderful. You know, I wanted to give you a chance just to speak to the Shalom TV community just for one moment. And the event speaks for itself in many ways. At the same time, I want you to articulate from me, just right from the heart, what are you trying to do here through ISGAP in general, and what do you hope to achieve starting here at this very wonderful luncheon?
So we're trying, from an academic perspective, to map and decode contemporary anti-Semitism and how it affects the academy and our education system, and basically to get onto the battlefield of ideas and fight. I think the Jewish community and truth and even justice we've left the battlefield, and we've left it to postmodernists who demonize Israel, who demonize the narrative, the connection, the cultural connection, the religious connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And mainstream education is shortchanging our students, and we have to fight back.
I want you to clarify for the audience. You've used two interesting words, the academy and the battlefield. What's the academy and what's the battlefield?
So I mean by the academy, I mean by the university, the higher education. And by the battlefield and seeding the battlefield, without getting too technical, I think in a sense since the 70s and 80s, postmodernity, Edward Said's Orientalism, they've critiqued the Western canon. And the Western canon at some level ought to have been critiqued. But now we need to critique the critique. When scholars are happy, like Judith Butler and others, to form an alliance with Hamas and Hezbollah, this sort of red-green alliance where feminists and human rights activists, or so-called human rights activists, can advocate positions of Hamas and Hezbollah, organizations that stand for an ideology that want to delegitimize and literally incite to genocidal anti-Semitism, as well as destroying democratic principles such as citizenship, the equality of men and women, of women's rights, of gay rights, of religious pluralism in society, that our acquiescence is creating a vacuum, and we need to fight back in the battlefield of ideas and then translate that to policy.
How serious a threat is Islamism as Islamic extremism to either the State of Israel or the contemporary Jewish community?
So it's a terrible threat, not only to the State of Israel and the Jewish people and diaspora communities in Europe, as we saw the shooting in Toulouse, but it's a greater threat to Muslims in Arab countries. You and I have been talking about this issue for 5 or 6 years, and today we look around the Middle East, and the Muslim Brotherhood's in power in Egypt. God knows what's going to happen in Syria, who's going to come to power in Syria, in Timbuktu, in Mali, which is the Jerusalem of sub-Saharan Africa. Africans look to Timbuktu as a cradle of civilization. The first universities, the first libraries are in Timbuktu, and Islamists are trying to erase any symbol, any sign of pre-Islamic culture in that part of the world. They don't respect difference, they don't respect other, and as people coming from democratic societies, as we have things to defend, we have things to protect, we have things to understand in our societies and defend it. And when we allow, and in some cases remain silent, or I dare say even aid and abet, this reactionary social movement, and it's justified in our university system, we are in serious trouble. And we need to deal with the issues.
To what extent was the very fact that Yale basically threw you out, closed down the institute, to what extent was that a symbol of a certain kind of anti-Semitism on American campuses?
From my perspective, I think it is almost an iconic moment in the American academy. When we are concerned about anti-Semitism, we can't speak out. The Jews have been the canary in the coal mine. When Gulf money, and I say this consciously with facts to back me up, when Gulf money dictates what the curriculum of our university system will be, or what the media will be. Now they're buying media. Al Jazeera in New York City is going to become a major operation in the near future. What does this mean to democratic principles, that those who are starting to buy, they speak about the Jewish lobby and nefarious Jewish control, but these guys are buying it right under our noses. What does that mean? What are the implications for democratic values and for our education system and the information that we receive, which is very crucial in this globalized internet moment?
So I want to contrast it, and I want you to give me a real sense from your perspective. You and I met on Shalom TV when they had closed down Yale. And look, the audience knows I'm a dear friend of yours. I am a huge fan. I feel that one of the things Shalom TV does is give ISGAP more of a platform. And I want the entire Jewish world and I want the entire American community to understand the work you're doing. To what extent, in contrast, does the fact that Fordham, Stanford, Harvard, you have put together now a group of American universities which have welcomed you? Does, in fact, this give you as much hope as the Yale action was painful and in some way was the signal, as you said, of something that is endemic in the academy? But I'm asking you now, in reflection, in contrast, does the fact that all of a sudden ISGAP is going to be in major universities give you some measure of hope? How do you evaluate that aspect of the story?
So there is hope, and there are amazing people who want to help and who care about the truth. Even if they don't agree with my personal perspective, they care about the issues, and they know that the issues ought to be examined and studied. So it gives me a lot of hope. But as I said to the top administrator who informed me at Yale that they were going to close our center, I stood up and shook his hand and told him I appreciate all the efforts that he made to allow us to be at Yale, because if it wasn't for him, we would not have been there. And when I shook his hand, I told him that the Torah teaches us that when one door is closed, another door opens. So other doors are opening. Yet at the same time, we have to be mindful of the fact that the last seminar that I gave, for example, at Yale was on the Muslim Brotherhood. And the liberal scholars were upset with me because they thought I portrayed the Brotherhood as too Islamist and that they were more nuanced and they really wanted a democracy. Now we see. Now we're living in a time when radical political Islam is sweeping the Middle East, and our intellectuals and I dare say our policymakers in this country are silent. Whereas France, Canada, there's other countries standing up to this. Why are we silent in the United States? Why is the Jewish community silent in this country where we're so free and have access to institutions and resources that we should be speaking out very clearly? And I think the silence still exists, which is perhaps the greatest challenge and the greatest danger. If our community remains silent, as we see this tidal wave, as Rabbi Sachs of the United Kingdom says, that we're living in a time of a tsunami of political anti-Semitism, which radical political Islam is at the fighting edge. Scholars are being silenced by, I would say, the shock troops of Muslim Brotherhood on American campuses. Gulf states are buying chairs and controlling departments. What are we coming to? And when do we speak out? And as Hillel said, if not now, when?
The when is now because of you. Kol tuva hatzlacha. I am thrilled for you. And I thank you on behalf of all of American Jews who watch Shalom TV. What you're doing is extraordinary work. And I, personally, look, you're on our panel, you're on our board, and you have been a wonderful source of information to us through Shalom TV. So I just hope you'll get into the studio as often as possible, and we'll stay with you. We'll be at every panel that you have and every educational forum that you have. And I can't thank you enough for all you've done for all of us and what you've done for me personally. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mark.
Charles Small.
Many times we've had events here which relate to topics that we all concern ourselves with, but today we have the opportunity to work with an organization that actually does something about this problem, that raises a public consciousness level about it, and that is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Now, many of you may remember vaguely that several years ago this entity, which was headquartered at Yale University, was summarily and unceremoniously ejected. And, I'm not one of those people that beats around the bush. They were ejected because, sadly, one of the most contemporary sources of global anti-Semitism since the Nazi era is, unfortunately, many in the Muslim world and Muslim governments. And you will get a sampling of that in a visual in short order. And so, because there's so much funding to Yale for various programs from many of these Arab governments, Emirates, and so forth, this institute was ejected from Yale. Thankfully, there are good Jesuits at Fordham University who saw the wisdom of letting people know and understanding the origins of this problem And it is a very serious problem that didn't emerge yesterday. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is at the core of this problem, emerged somewhat simultaneously with the Nazi Party. Many of you know that Syed Qutb founded the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1929, around the same time that the Nazis were becoming very active. And later in a continuum, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, coordinated with Hitler in the event, as he hoped, that the Nazis would overrun the Levant, and then Palestine would come also within the reaches of the Nazi flag, and they would be able to exterminate the Jews with the Muslim legions joining in. So it's not a new problem. And of course, it continues with the overthrow, I might add, the overthrow assisted by our government of the Shah of Iran, which then exploded the entire Islamist extremist problem and brings us to an increasing number of Muslim Brotherhood governments today. And this problem, of course, is exacerbated by the silencing of moderate Muslims and the increasing growth of Islamic extremism. So that's really a main core of the problem. That's not to insinuate that anti-Semitism doesn't emerge from other quarters as well, but in its threatening and genocidal aspects, unfortunately, it comes from one particular corner. So before we begin, I just want to recognize some individuals here who are known to us and who've done some wonderful work for us in many endeavors. First of all, the soon retiring chancellor of the City University, it's really painful to say this, the fabulous Matthew Goldstein, who's done so much for public education in New York. Bernice Manicherian, the former national president of AIPAC, former New York State Senate leader Manfred Orenstein, former Senator Seymour Lackman, Frank Gaffney, who is the director of the Center for Security Policy, who monitors many of the problems that we are all concerned with, actor Tony LoBianco, who did a great job in the recent production of LaGuardia, not to mention all of his other credits, Professor Michael Curtis. You ought to Google him and read some of his writings. They're superb, excellently researched. Harold Rode, who was one of our speakers several years ago on behalf, at that time, of the Claremont Institute, now at the Gatestone Institute. And, of course, Brooke Goldstein. This pretty lady with her beguiling innocence, she carries a heavy weapon. Let me tell you, she knows how, in many instances, the law is being used against our advantage here in this country through the Lawfare project which she runs. And, of course, former Deputy Mayor and Judge Milt Mullen. Where's Milt? Yeah, right here. Great to see you. Okay, so the first thing we'll do, we're going to see a very brief video just to give you the diagnosis. So that will run 3 minutes.
هم يريدوا أن يثبتوا للعالم أن يثبتوا للواقع الدولي والإقليمي أنهم أصحاب حق. هم جرثومة غريبة، جرثومة وميكروب لا مثيل له في الوجود.
نحن نعادي يهود حتى ولو أعادوا إلينا فلسطين.
هؤلاء هم اليهود باختصار، وإن لنا عندهم نحن المسلمين لثأرا لا والله لن ينقضي.
Radical Islamists, I'm not speaking about Islam and I'm not speaking about Muslims in general, but radical political Islamists have as their raison d'etre, as their mission, to demonize the state of Israel and to demonize Jews. And they're doing it in the most pernicious way possible. And they see Jews as an enemy of Islam, and they are literally out to kill them.
Bullet holes in a quiet suburban school where pupils cowered for 2 hours after hearing more than a dozen shots being fired outside. The dead, one of the school's rabbis, Jonathan Sandler, and his 2 children, aged 3 and 6. Also killed was the daughter of the school's head teacher.
So for this disaffected young French immigrant in Toulouse to go and kill innocent children in a schoolyard is something that is unfortunately predictable, and we in the academy and we in the media refuse to engage in the analysis of this type of genocidal anti-Semitism. And it's our silence that is actually creating a horrific vacuum in the Islamic world. The way the Iranian revolutionary regime is using anti-Semitism and exporting it throughout the world, that this potentially is a greater threat not only to the Jewish people but to democratic values and democracies throughout the world than their nuclear weapons program. That they are exporting the most pernicious forms of genocidal anti-Semitism that came out of Nazi Germany. The Iranian revolutionary regime has been using genocidal forms of anti-Semitism masterfully. Ahmadinejad, he's making statements that the Jews somehow manipulated the world and faked the Holocaust to steal the land of Palestinians or to swindle the Europeans out of resources for reparations. So in other words, blaming not only the victim of the Holocaust, but in a sense, you could even say trying to murder the Jewish people's history and delegitimizing even their memory. So the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which was founded in 2004, I believe can make a difference in that we are not content of staying in the ivory tower to analyze this social phenomenon, but to do things about it. I hope that if we're successful at trying to reach our objective, that we will be an institution that will bring about and make a difference on these issues, to educate people, to educate the academy, and to have an impact on policy matters.
I want to say at the outset that I'm not here, rumors aside, because ISGAP is a tenant of the AJC building on East 56th Street, and we want to ensure successful fundraising so they pay their rent on time every month. That's not the reason I'm here. It would help. I'm here because I've known Charles Small pretty much since the beginning of this journey. In 2004, 2005, before Yale, through Yale, and post-Yale. And I'm simply here to offer my, if you will, letter of reference, and to thank all of you for showing the support that you have for ISGAP by being here today. There was a time in the 1990s, many of you will recall, when many wanted to believe that anti-Semitism was a declining issue. And we all harbored hopes. And we had a wake-up call, did we not, by 2000, 2001, when we realized that not only was anti-Semitism not dying, but in many respects, it was showing its capacity both to sustain old forms and invent new forms. In 2000, I was on sabbatical, living in Europe for the year, and teaching at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna. Some of you know the SICE program. So I had the perspective both of, if you will, a Jewish community activist and also a member of the academy. And what I saw then in 2000 and 2001 and in the years beyond was something quite frightening. I saw the son of a Holocaust survivor watching his mother from France, once again hearing the words, mort aux Juifs. I swore as a son that my mother would never again hear those words, death to the Jews. She had heard them enough during the Shoah. And here in the year 2000, 2001, we were living in Geneva, and just across the border in France, once again, mort aux Juifs. And what we saw in the unfolding years and through our travels, in my case through AJC, in my years at Johns Hopkins and subsequently as a visiting scholar at Oxford, has been the emergence and reemergence of three forms of anti-Semitism that need to concern us profoundly. In no particular order, the anti-Semitism of the far right, particularly in Europe, manifested through parties like the Golden Dawn in Greece, about which I'm sure you've read, which are taking advantage of the economic crisis, the sense of social anomie, to use Emil Durkheim's term, and this fear of the immigration to Europe that is, in many respects, inundating countries that were ill prepared for it, in order to take popular advantage. You see it in Hungary through the Jobbik Party. You see it in Greece through the Golden Dawn Party, both of which, as you know, are in the parliament, with quite respectable figures in the elections. You see a second group, the far left. This is the group that, in particular, in the academy, whether it was at Yale or at Johns Hopkins or at Oxford, or I certainly won't speak for Professor Lewis, he'll speak for himself, but at other universities that I'm sure you've encountered, this unwillingness to engage and confront and name names about this campaign to delegitimize the State of Israel. Uniquely, we are told, among the 193 member states of the United Nations, only one has its very right to exist challenged through lawfare and other means. And yet we are told this is in no way meant to be about the Jews. Go figure. The one Jewish state, the one experiment in the rebirth of Jewish self-determination, is the one and only national expression that is subjected to relentless challenge. And the third, and I came in, Charles, when you were on screen, is within the Islamic world. Now, we are told, and again, I defer to the experts, Bob Satloff and Bernard Lewis, but we are told again and again, impossible. We're all the children of Abraham. We're all Semites. There was no Shoah in the Islamic world. Well, if the standard is there was no Shoah, perhaps. But is that the beginning and end of the conversation? Recently, an AJC group was in Berlin at the Federal Chancellery. We were meeting with a very, very senior official. They had just met with President Morsi of Egypt that day. And so we inquired, how did the meeting go? The official said, the Chancellor gave President Morsi the opportunity to walk back from his comments of 3 years ago that I'm sure all of you are so familiar with. And he did not. He did not. The official said to us, we were surprised. Our response to the official, whom we knew well enough to say this, was, we're surprised that you're surprised. I mean, what exactly is it about the Muslim Brotherhood with which Mohammed Morsi has been affiliated for decades? What exactly is it about their Weltanschauung? What exactly is it about their political perspective that you chose not to get? They didn't keep it a secret. They weren't hiding it from you. They weren't masquerading all those years as democratic pluralists. They were who they said they were. And yet, like many, they were unwilling. And the challenge we face is for the people of goodwill in the academy, in the chancelleries, elsewhere, to wake up, as they say, and smell the coffee. I can tell you that in November 2001, I sat opposite Hubert Védrine, the foreign minister of France, 2 months after 9/11. And just after coming back from that year in Europe, and I said, Mr. Minister, there is a problem in France. It must be confronted. But for it to be confronted, it must be named. He said, Monsieur Harris, I beg to differ. I know my country better than you do. The problem is a problem of hooliganism. No, Mr. Minister, the problem is not a problem of hooliganism. That exists, to be sure. But that's not what we're talking about, and there was not a direct line from hooliganism in 2001 to Toulouse in March 2012, where 3 Jewish children and a teacher were killed in cold blood for one simple reason, and only one. They were Jews. People have to name names. They have to call it what it is. ISGAP has come along and filled a very important vacuum. Many years ago, as Charles knows, AJC had helped to fill that vacuum. If you go back to 1949, 1950, the 5-volume Studies in Prejudice of Theodore Adorno and Bruno Bettelheim, that was us. That was AJC's academic and scholarly research to try and put a framework around what had just happened in the Shoah. But over the years, as we devoted more and more of our time to frontline activist work, we relinquished some of that scholarly activity. Along comes Charles Small, along comes ISGAP, and says, we have to confront it in the place where it matters so deeply, the academy. We have to do the scholarly research that cannot be so simply rejected or minimized by others out there who say, well, after all, it's the AJC speaking, what do you expect? We need the impeccable scholarly research which Charles and his team are providing in order to help wake up the world to the realities as they are. Not because we're trying to score points, yes, because we're trying to survive and not repeat history, but ultimately, and with this I close, because we have understood that anti-Semitism is a cancer that, left to metastasize, spreads and ultimately destroys the fabric and fiber of democratic societies. We're the beginning of this. I don't want to refer to us as the canary in the mine, because the canary must die for the miner to live. That's not the reference I wish to use. But we're the early warning system. When 3 children are killed in Toulouse in cold blood by a murderer who attaches to his shirt a video camera wanting to capture the scene in the killing of 3 Jewish children, believing that the video will go viral in his world and bring him a special place in heaven. When that kind of a world exists, we may be on the front line, but believe me, our message in Washington and at the UN and throughout Europe and Asia and Africa and Latin America is the same message. You may or may not be Jewish. You may or may not even care a whole lot about Israel. But if you don't wake up to this threat, one day it's going to engulf us all. And when it does, you're going to look back and ask yourself, where was I? Groups like AJC on the front line, scholarly research groups like ISGAP will not let us get to that point. Bless you for your work, Charles. Bob Satloff and Bernard Lewis, thank you for all that you do in each of your respective fields, and thank you for your support.
We are here today to discuss anti-Semitism, the central theme of ISGAP, and what gathers all of us here with Bernard Lewis is a truly special treat. And I think if it's all right, Bernard, we should start at the beginning. What, in your view, is the right definition for anti-Semitism?
Well, there are in fact 2 definitions of anti-Semitism. We use the word commonly in 2 related but quite distinctly different senses. The first meaning is having a negative attitude towards Jews. That's normal. I mean, it's part of human nature to dislike, despise, and where convenient, to persecute people who are different. And there's no reason why Jews should be the exception to that. In that sense, we find anti-Semitism everywhere in all periods. The other meaning is attributing to Jews some unique and special quality of cosmic evil. That, as I say, it's related, but it's distinctly different. And I think if we talk about anti-Semitism, we have to be careful to distinguish between these two different interpretations and make sure what we mean.
And when did anti-Semitism begin, and how did it begin?
In which sense?
Well, let's take the second sense, the cosmic evil sense.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the first one briefly. I mean, in the ancient world, by which I mean the Greco-Roman world, we find negative comments about the Jews. But then we find negative comments about everybody. I mean, why should the Jews be exempt? And some of the negative comments about Jews have a certain basis in fact. I mean, the Jews, for example, had this peculiar habit of resting every seventh day, something which was unknown to the rest of humanity. Eventually, it was more widely adopted, and its Jewish origin, its uniquely Jewish origin, was forgotten. But for a long time, this was one of the main accusations against Jews. Another more serious one was their refusal to recognize any god but their own. In the ancient world, every place, every group had its own god or gods whom they worshipped in accordance with their own local customs. And it was normal, if you were traveling, courtesy as a visitor or in deference to a suzerain, to offer some act of worship to somebody else's god. The Jews were alone in refusing to do that. They insisted that their faceless God was the only God, and all the others were false, and they refused to make the slightest gesture towards any other god, which brought them the reputation of being discourteous neighbors and seditious subjects.
All right, so that's the general environment. But where did the idea that Jews are evil or produce evil, where did that come from?
That comes much later. As I say, the first form of anti-Semitism is what you might call normal negativism. It comes later at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when you may recall that in a number of European countries, Jews were given the choice, either leave or convert. One European country after another issued an order expelling the Jews. They could only evade that order by converting. And obviously, with a forced conversion, there is some suspicion about its sincerity. So you began to investigate the sincerity of converts into the second and third and fourth generation and so on. And that is where you have the beginning of something that you might call anti-Semitism, something which is attributing to Jews some special quality of evil. It begins, I would say, in the late Middle Ages, first in Spain and then everywhere else in Christendom.
And from your historical study, does this sense of Jews having cosmic evil, can this be remedied? Is this a disease that has a cure? Or is this just part of the fabric of societies?
I'm a historian, which means that my professional competence is dealing with the past, not the future. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, as the Bible says. I hope that there may be a cure. I can't make any promises. And there isn't much sign of it at the present time.
So let's look at one specific case in Europe. Let's look at the country of England, a country where at one time Jews were expelled and persecuted, and then several hundred years later Jews welcomed back, and then eventually this is a country that became the source of the Balfour Declaration to give Jews at least a promise of sovereignty. How does England go from intense persecution to protection and defense of Jews?
Well, the first phase of persecution was normal. That was how it was everywhere in Christian Europe. And the English position was no worse than elsewhere. And the second one is the second phase is the more interesting one. And I have my own explanation of this, which you may or may not accept. At the end of the 18th century, after a devastating war between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, the Russians were victorious, imposed a peace treaty on the defeated Ottomans, one clause of which obliged the Ottomans to recognize the Russian Tsar as the patron and protector of the Orthodox Church in Istanbul. Now, the Turks understood this to mean one building in one place. The Russians interpreted it to mean one community all over the Ottoman Empire. And as the victors in the war, they were able to enforce their own interpretation. So the Russian government had a right of intervention and involvement and the local support of a large and important community all over the Ottoman Empire. The French immediately responded by demanding a similar right of protection for the Catholic population of the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottomans agreed to give them, probably because they thought it would be a useful counterwhelm. The British at the time were devastated, and this is not conjecture, this is well documented in the British archives. Their two main competitors in the Middle East at that time, Russia and France, had each obtained a right of intervention and involvement and the support of a local community, an important local community. What could they do? There are no Protestants in the Middle East. And they batted this back and forth, and as I said, this is well documented in the British archives. And then round about 1802 or 1803, I don't remember the exact date, somebody came up with an idea. He said, let's protect the Jews. They're a large and active community all over the Ottoman Empire, and they could certainly use some protection. It was agreed that this was a good idea. So an approach was made to the Jewish leadership, and as you would expect, the Jews responded gratefully and eagerly. So an arrangement was set up whereby the British government was recognized as the patron and protector of the Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire, with the same rights of involvement and intervention that the Russians and the French had, the Protestants and Catholics. That was the beginning of a relationship which continued and developed right through the 19th century and into the early 20th century. It is, in a sense, the background of the Balfour Declaration.
Very interesting. Now, let me ask you more broadly. When we think of Europe and Europe's relationship to Jews, obviously this is all under the shadow of the Shoah. But depending on where you are in Europe, you have very different relationships to Jews. Scandinavia versus Italy, Germany versus Poland versus England and France.
Well, even in Scandinavia, Norway versus Denmark.
Norway versus Denmark. So
very different.
What is it in Europe? What is it? Is it something in the water that compels different national approaches, national attitudes toward dealing with Jews?
I'm afraid I have no answer to that question. It's a very interesting and important question, and we see this all over Europe. If you look at the period of Nazi domination in Europe, the behavior of different countries is very, very different. In some countries, the local populations cooperated eagerly and willingly in the persecution and extermination of their Jews. In others, they did what they could to save them. Some European countries had a very honorable record in that respect. Bulgaria, for example. Bulgaria was an Axis ally, but they took great care to protect their Jews, and they succeeded. Why this difference, I don't know, and one would need a detailed knowledge of European history, which I don't possess.
Let's make the transition across the Mediterranean to talk about the Middle East, and to talk about the Muslim world more generally. Now, you have written that Europeans brought anti-Semitism to the Middle East. How did that happen? Wasn't it there before? Was there no anti-Semitism in Muslim societies?
Well, it depends what you mean by anti-Semitism. If you simply mean a negative attitude to Jews, yes, of course it was there. Among Muslims, there was a negative attitude to non-Muslims. But the negative attitude to Jews was no different from the negative attitude to Christians. In fact, it was probably rather better, because Christianity was the rival religion, the rival empire. Jews were regarded as comparatively harmless and even useful. So that in the Ottoman Empire, for example, Jews were in a sense favored. In that sense, you don't have anti-Semitism. It comes at a fairly late date when it was introduced mainly by Christian missionaries from Europe.
And how did this transmission happen? And how did it spread?
Well, it's first documented at the time of the Dreyfus Trial.
The Dreyfus Trial.
Which was followed with great interest in the Middle East. Generally speaking, the Middle Eastern comment at the time among Muslims was very sympathetic to Dreyfus. They were outraged at this treatment of a man who was obviously innocent and the charges brought against him. But then it was brought by missionaries and others, and it began to catch on. It was translated into Arabic and adapted into Muslim terms and so on. So that from then onwards, it begins to spread and take root. And then, of course, with the Nazis in power in Germany, it becomes a really powerful force. I mean, you know, there's the old Arabic saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Obviously, since the British and the French were dominating the Middle East, the enemies of the British and the French were seen as possible friends. So at various times, they were pro-German, pro-Russian, and so on. And one of the messages they got from Europe at that time was anti-Semitism.
Now, there is a widespread conventional wisdom, I'll call it the Golden Age principle, that Jews lived in Muslim lands as though it were a golden age of equality and Jewish rights in Muslim societies. Now, you have written that, I believe the term in an article that I've just reread from you, that this is nonsense. Is this nonsense?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's nonsense, but it should be, I should say it's a misreading and a misinterpretation of the facts. Jews did not have equal rights, but they did have rights. This is the important difference. In the Muslim system, there was official recognition in Muslim law, even in Quranic law, of certain non-Muslim religions, particularly Jews and Christians. Jews and Christians, from the Muslim point of view, had received authentic revelations, but had stuck to the old ones instead of accepting the new one, namely Islam. So they were recognized, and they were given a lawful status and allowed to practice their religion. It was a status of legal, fiscal inferiority. They had to accept that, they had to behave themselves, they had to pay their taxes and obey the rules. But if they did so, then they were tolerated and even in certain circumstances helped. And it's remarkable, for example, that when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, they were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire. This was not because the Ottomans were generous and welcoming, it was because they saw the Jews as useful.
Let's jump ahead a couple of centuries and ask about Israel and anti-Semitism. Is being anti-Israel the same as being anti-Semitic? And when does one cross into the other?
No, it's not the same, but it may become the same. I mean, Israel is a state which pursues policies and does things, and it is perfectly legitimate to criticize that state and its policies. Where it ceases to be legitimate, if that criticism is inspired by prejudice rather than by objective valuation of the facts. And if you look at the international discourse, I don't think it's too difficult to distinguish between those criticisms of Israel that I would call normal and legitimate and those that are inspired by anti-Semitism. The second, especially, the category where Israel is held to a higher standard than any other country in the world. For example, treatment of minorities. Israel has an Arab minority, mainly Muslim, partly Christian. And they are citizens. They have the same rights as other citizens. They have some rights that other citizens don't have. For example, they're not required to do military service. They can volunteer if they wish, and some of them do, and so on. And they have a position which is more favorable than in any Muslim country in the region for people who are not members of the majority religion. And some Muslim writers have even seen this. And one of them, in particular, I recall, had the courage to say so. It was a Muslim Arab professor said in a speech that there is there is only one country in the Middle East where the ordinary Arab man in the street has decent rights and decent care from childhood onwards, and that is as a second-class citizen of the Jewish state. It's true, but it was very courageous of him to say so.
Now, in your view, if we waved a magic wand and somehow Israel solved the Palestinian issue to the satisfaction of the Palestinians, the two sides solved it together, what impact would that have on the problem of anti-Semitism from Muslim societies today?
No, I can't see that happening, frankly. I think one has to distinguish, though, between anti-Semitism and hostility to Israel. I mean, as I said before, Israel is a state which pursues policies, and rivalry between states is a perfectly normal thing in our world. And if you look at the literature and look at the statements and look at the policies and actions, I don't think it's too difficult to distinguish between political hostility to the state of Israel and anti-Semitism.
Let me ask you more specifically about the role of anti-Semitism among Islamist movements. Now, we've seen Israel celebrating its 65th birthday. For the first half or so of its existence, its antagonists were more secular republics.
Yeah, you must remember that anti-Semitism, in the correct sense of that word, is a fairly recent innovation in the Muslim world. By that, I don't mean that they didn't have prejudice against Jews. As I said, to hate or dislike and where convenient to persecute people who are different is normal human behavior. But that sort of special quality of evil attributed to Jews is characteristic of European anti-Semitism. This was unknown in the Muslim world until it was introduced from Europe. But then it caught on.
And it seems to be a very special core element of Islamist political movements today.
Sometimes, not always. If you look at the literature, I think one can see a fairly clear distinction between what you might call Islamic anti-Israel policies and attitudes and European-style anti-Semitism. There's an interesting text which was produced during the war, during World War II, that is, by the German government. They were trying very hard to cultivate the Arabs, but there was this problem of anti-Semitism, and after all, the Arabs were Semites, and so on. And a German Orientalist was given the task of finding a way to persuade the Arabs that this was purely anti-Jewish and didn't affect them at all. He wrote a rather interesting text explaining this, and he said that it's unfortunate that we use this word anti-Semitism. We don't really mean that. It's purely anti-Jewish. It has nothing to do with you Arabs. And they did quite well in cultivating the Arabs during the war, as you know.
So if you, given that you have in your career not just explained history and opened up past worlds, but offered advice to leaders around the Middle East and here in the United States. If you were to offer advice to people in this group, for example, about the most effective ways to address the problems of anti-Semitism today, what would you say?
That's too vague a question.
All right, let's be more precise. Let's focus first on anti-Semitism in Arab and Muslim societies.
Oh, the only way one could hope to achieve anything is by education. The problem is the education is controlled by the wrong people in those societies.
Controlled by the wrong people.
Yes. But there are signs of hope. The Arabs become willing to listen and even to agree when they feel themselves to be confronting a greater danger than the Jews. The most striking example of that is President Sadat of Egypt. I mean, why did President Sadat of Egypt decide to make peace with Israel? Because Egypt was becoming a Russian colony. I mean, I'm old enough to remember both the British and the Russian periods in Egypt. And the Russian presence in Egypt was more dominant, more aggressive, more insulting than the British presence had ever been, even at the height of British imperial power. I remember an Egyptian friend of mine at the time put it very well. He said both the British and the Russians treat Egypt as their cow. He said the difference is the British wanted milk, the Russians want beef.
So dealing with Arab and Muslim societies and anti-Semitism.
Yes. I don't really think that anti-Semitism, as we understand that word in the Western world, is a major factor in the Arab world. I mean, Jews, of course, like Christians, were regarded as inferior. They were part of a lower order. But they were tolerated provided they accepted their inferior status and behaved themselves according to the rules laid down by the Muslims. And that has generally been the attitude. And it is still, to a large extent, the attitude, even at the present day.
But today, now that we have governments such as, say, the government of Iran, and perhaps, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood-led government in Egypt, and perhaps an even more radical-led government in a future Syria, should we fear the anti-Semitic component of a foreign policy advocated by these governments?
Oh yes, there's certainly that danger. Iran is a good case.
And so when we hear the genocidal talk of an Ahmadinejad, should we say irrelevant, or should we say very relevant indeed?
No, we should take notice of it. And remember, there's a particular dangerous element in the situation. I mean, during the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States had nuclear weapons. But neither side used them because of what was known as MAD, mutual assured destruction. Each side knew that if they used these weapons, the other would respond in kind, leading, as I said, to mutual assured destruction. Now, with these people, it doesn't work, because for them, with their apocalyptic mindset, mutual assured destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Bernard Lewis.
So before we go to the questions and answers, we're going to hear from Dr. Charles Small. As you know, these are things that many of us hold dear. These are important. This is an important mission, and I hope you'll take to heart what he has to say to you. I just want to say to you, Mr. Lewis, I'm sure on behalf of everyone here, if all of us are fortunate enough to reach your age, we know that we will long since have, we won't even remember that which you long forgot on the 83rd or 84th anniversaries of our bar and bas mitzvahs. Charles?
So thank you very much, Jeff Wiesenfeld. Thank you so much for organizing this amazing luncheon. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank not only Jeff, but Bunsey Churchill for making this possible, that Professor Lewis was here. Professor Lewis, thank you so much for being here. It's a profound honor Thank you. I'd also like to thank Rob Satloff and David Harris for coming to put in some good words for ISGAP and endorsing our project. In a time when we need to act together to show solidarity and work together to deal with the issues of the day, the profound and important issues of the day, it's amazing to be in the company of two leaders of our community, David Harris and Rob Satloff, who are not only doing amazing, important, integral work, but are very generous in trying to expand the efforts of the community and the reach of the community. And I just wanted to say that Rob is a mentor and a friend from our days in graduate school and has been a source of guidance for the last 12, 13 years when I've been doing this. And David Harris, as he alluded to, when I came to him with the idea of creating the research center, ISGAP, bringing ISGAP to Yale, he was very generous and actually helped me to network with leading philanthropists in the community. And being not from New York and not even from the United States, being a Canadian Israeli, that effort and assistance was great and helped to pave the way for moving ISGAP to Yale. So we're living in a time, in the words of Elie Wiesel, of great urgency. And Elie Wiesel, when he said these words, went on to correct himself in saying, no, we're living in a time of an emergency. And Elie Wiesel said those words in 2002. I recently met him. He's the honorary president of ISGAP, and I meet him on occasion. I met him growing up on occasion. He had a sister in Montreal who was a member of my family synagogue, and we would meet. And about 6 weeks ago, I sat with him in his office, and I've never seen him like this. The times and the challenges are significant and serious. And I believe that ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, can play a role perhaps in the most important arena, the battlefield, and it is a battlefield, the battlefield of ideas. As David Harris alluded to, the academy, the place that we assume would find the solutions, would put proposals and experiments and create rationales to cure different forms of hatred, including anti-Semitism, in some cases has actually become the problem in and of itself. The fact that we were closed down at Yale is a long story which I don't want to get into, but the fact that in one fell swoop, the university closed down a center with 14 employees for the first time with a confidential academic review committee's report, the first time the committee's report was deemed classified, says something. I want to relay 3 short stories that I've heard only in the last month with colleagues. There's a young scholar in New York City at one of the finest universities, also a recent graduate of Oxford University. Brilliant. She has 2 books out. She's just at an entry-level academic posting. And she told her mentor, who was a Jewish professor who cares about these issues, that she wanted to create a symposium, a one-day symposium on issues of anti-Semitism in her department. She didn't say what the theme was going to be. She didn't say what kind of scholars she wanted to invite, but just to have a symposium on issues of anti-Semitism. Her mentor, who cares about the issues and cares about this young scholar's future career, told her that if she does this, it will be career suicide, and warned her not to do it. Within hours, 2 junior faculty members walked into her office and sat down and told her that we are pro-Palestinian, and if you do this, your career will be finished. We'll drive you out of the department. That's one story. The second story is there's a great scholar from a university in Chicago who wrote, I think, one of the most brilliant books on anti-Judaism in a long time. It's a very important book, and it recently came out. He told me, even though he was a full professor, that he never told any of his colleagues in his department or in his social circles what book he was writing, because if he had told them before it was published, it would be possible that the project would be jeopardized and he would have all sorts of problems at his work. Once the book was published, he told his colleagues that the book is on the shelves and this is what he's done. Recently, I invited a scholar. ISGAP has academic programming, as it said in the video, at Fordham University, at the Harvard Law School, at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and also at McGill University. We've just expanded to UCLA, and the University of Miami is coming on, and we're starting programming in Europe, at some of the finest universities in England and in Italy. We're starting ISGAP Italia in the next couple of months with leading scholars. This British scholar who comes from a humble background, went to polytechnics or the community colleges while he was studying, made his way up. He's a brilliant legal scholar. He ended up going to the London School of Economics, and he's a professor in London. And it was his dream since he was a child to visit Cambridge, Massachusetts, and just walk the streets and look into the law school. And I invited him to participate in our seminar series. He gave a brilliant paper about the European context of anti-Semitism and international legal issues. And we went out for dinner and drinks afterwards in the local restaurant, pub. And he was thanking me profusely for giving him the opportunity to fulfill his childhood dream and to give a lecture at the Harvard University Law School. And I said, wonderful, it's a pleasure, your paper was great. And I said, what did your family and friends think? And he goes, well, I told my family, but I didn't tell any of my friends or colleagues. This is London, 2013. If he would have told his colleagues in his department, he would have been reprimanded for doing a paper on anti-Semitism. The university has been ceded. We've left it. Postmodernity, Edward Said's critique of the Western canon is what prevails. It's the dominant school of thought today. And we as a community, we who care about democratic principles and the future of our community and the state of Israel, if I may say that, we have ceded the territory over the battlefield of ideas to people who have demonized Israel and delegitimized the Jewish narrative or claim to that part of the world. And I would argue that ISGAP must bring the best scholars, the best thinkers, to critique the critique of the Western canon, so that scholars like Judith Butler, who says that Hamas and Hezbollah are part of the progressive left and need to be supported, this sort of red-green alliance needs to be challenged. The hypocrisy is so profound, and yet this is mainstream education. So if you're a good scholar, if you're a good social scientist, if you're a good journalist, if you become a good policymaker, you've been trained for 3 or 4 years to be critical of the racist entity in the Middle East, the racist colonial entity. So no longer I would argue, can we afford to put out the fires, the Waltz and Mersheimers, or Ken Livingston in London, these, sort of extreme cases 10 years ago of people who we knew clearly were anti-Semitic and demonizing Israel. Today, as Rabbi Sachs of the United Kingdom says, and I think he's correct, we're living through a tsunami of anti-Semitism. We can no longer put out fires. And the battlefield of ideas, Edward Said is in his grave, but his ideas are dominant in the finest universities in the Western world. We need to bring people to critique the critique, to bring rational, well-argued, detailed studies, and to challenge the hypocrisy that we all know and we all see. I'm going to end on a final note, because I said I'd be brief. And I want to tell you a quick story about my nephew, Zachary. Zachary is a very talented young kid. He's 7 years old, and he loves music. He was born with this ear. He's a very talented, nice kid. He lives in Montreal, and I took him around Hanukkah to HMV, which is a great music store in Montreal, a British music store. Has 4 floors of all the best music from all over the world you can imagine. So I brought him to the store, and I said, Zachary, I'm going to buy you a CD for Hanukkah. So he ran around the store. In 10 minutes, he came back with about 8 CDs and arms full of all kinds of tchotchkes, as they say. And he looked at me and he said, Uncle Charles, I need this. So I looked into his eyes and I said, Zachary, if you need it, I'll buy everything. But I have a question for you. I said, do you need it or do you want it? And he looked at me like a deer in the headlights for about 30 seconds. And he thought deeply. And he said, Uncle Charles, I don't need any of this. I just wanted it. I'll put it back. And I said, no, it's okay, Zachary. I'll buy you a CD for Hanukkah. and I'm happy to do that. And I tell the story because I think, as a community, we can no longer cede the battlefield of ideas. We can no longer put up with it. And we need to bring the best people from an interdisciplinary perspective to research and to fight for the truth. Thank you very much.
I want to thank one of our partners, Shalom Television, which has recorded this event and will no doubt broadcast, and we're very grateful to Shalom TV. So we have David Harris, Bob Satloff, Charles Small, Dr. Lewis. Charlie?
The question is nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't work out the way that George W. Bush thought, and dialogue with the Muslim world under President Obama didn't work out the way he thought it should work. Having a dialogue with Iran doesn't work. Having a dialogue with Syria doesn't work. So if nation building doesn't work and dialogue doesn't work, then what are the policy processes that might avoid apocalyptic endings?
The question, if I can sum it up, is if talking with the Iranians and negotiations with the Iranians don't work, what would work?
The simple answer is nothing. But I'll try and give you a more complicated one. The important thing to remember is that the entire Arab world, plus Iran, has absolutely nothing but fossil fuels. It was an Arab committee which reported not long ago that the entire exports of the entire Arab world, other than oil and gas, amount to less than those of Finland, one small European country. They have absolutely nothing else. Now, sooner or later, oil and gas will be either exhausted or superseded by other sources of energy. And when that happens, the Middle East will relapse into insignificance. And one can see the beginnings of that already, the extent to which the outside world is beginning to lose interest in the Middle East, and to the extent to which Middle Easterners are beginning to emigrate to other parts of the world. I would say, as I said, that in the decades to come, the Middle East will cease to matter.
Susan?
In your writings, I hope I'm representing them correctly, you talk about one of the problems in the Muslim world, the Arab world, being their lack of allowing women to participate fully in society.
Yeah.
Since this hopefully will be changing, do you see that that would make any difference at all in anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli opinion, or is it a factor not at all?
Well, I don't see much sign of it changing.
Yeah.
It was quite a long time ago, about sometime, if I remember rightly, in the 1860s, the discussion. By then, the Muslim world was keenly aware that it was falling behind the West, that in every significant respect, the West was a long way ahead of them, that they were becoming weak and poor and insignificant. And a long debate went on over many decades as to what was the cause of this. The usual human response to this sort of situation is to blame someone else. And they did plenty of that, of course. But they also did some honest discussion of what was wrong with their society. And they came up with various explanations. And then round about 1860, I don't recall the exact date, one of them came up with what I think was certainly the best answer ever until that time. He said the reason for the backwardness and failure of our society is the way we treat our women. By the way we treat our women, we deprive ourselves of the talents and services of half the population. And worse than that, we subject the early education, even of the other half, to illiterate, ignorant, and downtrodden mothers. I think he was making a very important point. And it took a long time before that point was accepted and understood by others in the Muslim world, and attempts were made to find a remedy to it. I think the treatment of women has really been one of the major sources of their relative backwardness.
It seems to me that not only Barenboim, who I mentioned, but so many Jewish professors. I have 2 grandsons at the University of Michigan, and they tell me some of their Jewish professors stand up there and tell them without question Israel is responsible for all the woes of the world. And it's not only in Michigan, it's not only in Columbia, it's in every university in the United States. How do we get these people to at least keep quiet rather than proselytize what is happening?
So it's a good question. I'll be brief. I think through education and with sound, high caliber, well-researched papers and curriculum and programs to debunk the myths, to take them on in the battlefield of ideas. And there are amazing scholars coming up who want an outlet. Professor Curtis just told me that one of his books on the Middle East couldn't be published because it was politically incorrect. The dominant way in the universities of perceiving Jewish culture, the Middle East, is through the lens of a worldview, of a framework that actually embraced the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Foucault and Said in Paris welcomed it. There's no mention of the rise or the influence of radical political Islam in the Islamic world, in the works of Foucault and of Said. And this blind spot, we can see the results. We can see the acquiescence in the academy and in policy to a social movement which is profoundly, diametrically opposed to Western democratic values. Forget anti-Semitism for a moment. Basic human rights, citizenship, the rights of women, the rights of religious minorities. There's a social movement that is even receiving support in the academy that is completely opposed to what we believe in. Why is that? And I believe through, and it takes time, but through education, through empowering young scholars to take on this hypocrisy, that we can win the battle of ideas. What Said achieved, he's sitting in his grave and he's reaping the rewards. We need to fight back.
Charles, if I could just add, Professor Lewis, I think unlike anyone else in this room, fought the battle of ideas directly against Professor Said. If I can say, one of the moments I will never forget, I was present at the Great Debate in 1985, where the Middle East Studies Association arranged a debate between Professor Said and Professor Lewis. Sadly, I thought the entire room was fixed, and it was a terrible moment in my memory because the room was fixed against Bernard Lewis. But Professor Lewis, could you offer a brief insight to the room about what Saidism means to the academy and the challenge of trying to overcome it?
Well, Saidism now has become a rigorously enforced orthodoxy in much of the academic world. People doing an academic career want to get on. They want to be promoted, they want to be given tenure, and they have to be politically correct. And being politically correct in much of the Middle Eastern studies world in American universities today means taking the Saidian line. Fortunately, there is an opposition group, but they are a small minority in the profession as a whole. My comment on this situation, I would offer in the form of one of my favorite quotations from the German poet Schiller, who famously said, "Gegen Dummheit kämpfen Götter selbst vergebens." Against stupidity, the gods themselves fight in vain.
Can one say, in a broad sense, that the Islamic religion itself is a danger? Some have said it's a religion of the sword. I remember at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, I saw some writings purportedly of Muhammad, which indicated that if you don't join that religion, you're an infidel and you shall be killed. And now we know about the Islamic extremists. I'm talking about the religion itself. Is the religion itself a danger?
Islam not only permits, it requires tolerance of other religions. within certain specific limits and according to certain specific conditions. Those religions have to follow a revelation, which in practice means Christians and Jews. They had earlier revelations which are recognized by the Muslims as authentic, but they failed to keep up and accept the last one. So Christians and Jews may practice their religion, may even enforce their laws in a Muslim state, provided that they pay the poll tax and accept their inferior status. And we see this, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, which was the last great Muslim state, where both the Christian and Jewish communities had full legal status, even a certain measure of autonomy, able to exercise and even enforce their own laws. In the Ottoman Empire, a Jew could be punished for eating on Yom Kippur or for violating the Sabbath. He would be punished by a Jewish court, which was able to impose a penalty and enforce it. The Jews had this measure of autonomy under Muslim law as a tolerated minority community.
Professor Lewis, I'd like to ask you why you would say that anti-Semitism was imported from Spain, when in fact the Quran is roughly 1/3 anti-Semitic, as are the Hadith. The phrase, "these Jews are the sons of apes and pigs," which we see so often today, is cited directly in the Quran twice at least that I know of, and Israel rejected Muhammad and therefore must be condemned to everlasting hellfire because the Jews must be defeated, and in the final Islamic apocalypse, and the Jews will be present and they will be massacred, and then there will be an Islamic empire. Why would you say that that was imported from Spain? Thank you.
Now, the Judaism was recognized as a religion in the Muslim state, in the Quran, and under Sharia, the Muslim holy law. The Jews were allowed to practice their religion. They were even allowed to, indeed required, to enforce their own laws, provided they accepted Muslim dominance. The kind of hostility that we find in Christian Europe, accusing the Jews of all kinds of evil deeds, finding them responsible for all the troubles of the world, that doesn't come until a much later stage in the Islamic world, when it was introduced from Europe. I'm not saying that there weren't negative feelings about Jews. There were, of course. I'm not saying there wasn't some persecution. There was, of course. But it was limited. And generally speaking, the treatment of the Jews in the Muslim world was far better than in pre-modern Christendom.
Paul? And then...
Thank you. Professor Lewis, I think everyone agreed in this room that long-term the Arab world's importance will decline because the rest of the world will have enough gas and enough oil and everything else. And anti-Semitism certainly is important to everyone in this room. But I think there's something much more important that I believe you're overlooking. What's your take on these people taking over all these countries? They have 20, 30, 40 years. And I don't think they hate the Catholics, the Christians and the Coptics and everyone else. Isn't that at least as important today as worrying or thinking that in 200 or 300 years no one will care about Saudi Arabia with their oil? There's a cell just across the river in Patterson or Passaic. I'd love to take you. See 50,000 Muslims that hate us. Isn't that more important today, and what are we going to do about it? Or can we do about it?
Yes, it is certainly true that there is a great and growing presence of Muslims in Europe. Muslims are increasing as a proportion of the population, both by immigration and by natural increase. Their birth rate is much higher than that of the local Christian populations. And in some areas they have already become a majority, and they are moving in that direction in much of Christian Europe. Some people in Europe realize that danger, but they don't know how to cope with it. I remember some years ago, I had a call from an Italian newspaper. They said they wanted to interview me. I was a little surprised, but I said yes, I was willing. And they said, well, we have this growing Muslim presence in Italy, which is becoming a threat to our very identity. What can we do to protect ourselves? And I said, well, the answer is very simple. Marry young and have children. And he slammed down the receiver. That wasn't the answer he wanted. But that's the only answer.
Thank you all very much for coming. Support ISGAP.